So we are live. Today I'm repeating the presentation from Apidays Paris. Last week I had a wonderful visit to the conference, met a lot of people, helped with the booth. So awesome experience. And yeah, today let's talk about Moonwalk and OpenAPI. I guess many of you who are watching this video already use OpenAPI. Maybe you have heard about OpenAPI 4, which is codenamed Moonwalk. And my idea today is to talk specifically about developer experience, OpenAPI, and what we would like to see in the next major release. So I'm a developer advocate. I work for Gradle. I mostly work on community management and advocacy for a Gradle build tool. Is one of our products, which is fully open source. You might remember me from Jenkins times. If you visit GitHub issues or Jira, most likely you will see my name. And I do quite a lot of community development. I really like developer tools and services, and hence I use APIs a lot. And I do a lot of consultancy work too. So speaking of OpenAPI, I think everyone uses it here one way or another. Most likely you know about it, maybe you don't know about it. But yeah, OpenAPI has been a kind of standard for years, and everyone runs with it. Last year at the API Days, I presented specifically on OpenAPI extensibility, how you can extend OpenAPI for your needs to pass additional metadata for formats. You can find this presentation on Speaker Deck. I actually have everything there. So if you go to Speaker Deck on Nenashev, here you can find all the presentations, including the current presentation. And you can also find a lot of other things I'm speaking about in terms of developer productivity, Java, Golang, YAML, and other projects I've participated in. Okay, so today we talk specifically about Moonwalk and OpenAPI 4. Last time I asked, last year, only a few people in the room knew what is Moonwalk. Hopefully today it is much better and it gets quite a lot of traction. Just a few disclaimers before we start. So I'm OpenAPI user. I'm not a contributor. I'm not a steering committee member. I do not have official hat in OpenAPI initiative. And I'm just sharing my experience as outsider who is really interested to see OpenAPI 4 happening. And I'm eager to support the team. But at the same time, I do not directly participate in the effort. And thanks to everyone from OpenAPI spec team and other committees for sharing feedback. This is second version of this presentation. After I did present at API Days, I ran my slides by the team and got a few feedback, some updates and feedback. So it's slightly new version. And if you still see something that is not correct, that needs adjustment, I would appreciate any feedback. You can find me on social media like Twitter, LinkedIn, or just on OpenAPI Initiative community Slack, and any feedback is appreciated. And last but not least, if we speak about OpenAPI, OpenAPI is an open specification and an open project, and it's driven by contributors. So if you want to see something happening, if you need particular things to happen, the best way to ensure that it happens is to contribute. And if you open the opening keynote from Eric Wilder, he actually shared how to contribute to OpenAPI. And there are many ways how you can participate. Okay, let's begin. One thing that often confuses people, especially who just start, is they expect OpenAPI to be a kind of formal specification that fully defines the behavior of your service. And unfortunately, this is not how it works. If you take OpenAPI definition, you might be able to actually build a service from this definition, but there is no guarantee that the service will be fully correct, that there will be enough information, and that you won't have to find additional information to actually understand how the things work. So OpenAPI is not really a formal specification, and of course, it's a subject for interpretation. It means that if you actually take OpenAPI, try to implement it, most likely with a real service, something will break. You will discover some missing fields or data that doesn't really behave as expected, or some custom responses that are not cannot be really reflected in OpenAPI, for example, stateful behavior. So there might be some surprises, and this is actually what we have to consider. For me, OpenAPI version 3 is not enough to actually build production code or model the services. And this has been one of the biggest problems for me as a developer for years since I've started using OpenAPI, when it was Swagger maybe 12 years ago, even more. I even did a blog post on that specifically for YMOG. It's my previous company, and there I presented how YMOG Cloud actually processes OpenAPI definitions to generate mock services, and how we built a mock library based on APIs Guru. So if you're interested, check out this blog post, or you can find a presentation from Lee Turner, again, on the site of the conference. Okay. So as I said, developer experience with OpenAPI, it might be better, and it's definitely one of the key items that concerns me. And it's also one of the items that concerns Gradle. Many perceive Gradle as a vendor of Gradle build tool. This is open source project that can build mostly Java applications, but also Python, Golang, etc. But actually, we do quite a lot of more. For example, we have Develocity, it's our enterprise product with support for build caching and many other capabilities. And we are also interested in developer productivity engineering as general. So it's a set of practices that allows you to build to increase developer productivity and actually to measure this developer productivity. So this is what we work on. And when we measure developer productivity, actually APIs is also one of the items we would normally consider in terms of how efficient is to use APIs, what are the problems, etc. And this is one of the metrics, for example, we try to collect internally. Just to provide a few examples specifically for Gradle, OpenAPI is used quite a lot. There are more than 100 plugins that use or reference OpenAPI in Gradle. There are famous ones like OpenAPI Generator that allows to actually generate a client and a code base from OpenAPI definition. So many of you have already tried this project at least once. And I would be really curious to know about your experiences, because sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, because again, OpenAPI is not fully formal specification. We also leverage OpenAPI in Develocity. If you use a service, of course, we expose API. We have OpenAPI specification that describes how to access the service, how to use the service, and our clients created integrations thanks to OpenAPI definitions. And actually, we approach OpenAPI not just as a single definition, but rather as a product. We have OpenAPI manual that explains how to use API, that fills deficiencies of OpenAPI specification. We also do versioning and deprecation for APIs. For both of that, there are actually capabilities of OpenAPI, but not everyone uses them. And one thing that is definitely missing in the specification, we have changelogs that can be consumed by people, and they could be understood. So when you evolve, when you adopt new versions, you can also get new versions of the API. And for that, we support quite a lot of open source projects, which you can try. Again, all the metadata for build automation, etc., is available. And with Develocity, we support many projects. And actually, OpenAPI Generator is one of them. So if you can check out a public instance. There are build scans. There is local and distributed build caching with Develocity. We also support predictive test selection and local observability. So all of the features are accessible through API, which you can try, you can play with it, and there is a public service just in case you can want to experiment with how we use OpenAPI. And yes, I said OpenAPI, Gradle, Develocity too many times, and actually it's for a reason, because the modern ecosystem has changed completely. So there is a big landscape. This is a landscape from CNCF. If you use OpenAPI, if you visited APIs Day, you have seen APIs landscape, which is probably even bigger than the CNCF landscape these days. And yeah, there are many tools that somehow interact with each other and that need to somehow operate. And there are many ways to do that. And for a long time, there has been Unix way, which we use all the time when we open our terminals. It's an approach when you write a program that does one thing and does it well. And these programs are supposed to work together well. Um, Last but not least, the programs need to interact with each other, and there is a universal interface. In the Unix way, the definition implies that there are text streams. Of course, in the modern world and in the API world, we talk that basically APIs become this way of interexchange between the services, and interoperability and interfaces actually become a key for modern application. All of us have hundreds of APIs we use on a daily basis, and our services use these APIs. So it's quite important to ensure that these communications are right. And it's important that communications are not just synchronous. So OpenAPI is basically a request response pattern. There are also many asynchronous APIs, and for that there is async API specification, which was also a part of our open specification, so both the Expo Hall. So there are many standards and many protocol implementations that can be described in these standards. And for today, I just focus on OpenAPI. So for OpenAPI, we have a really massive tool ecosystem. So there are hundreds of different tools, integrations like code generators, contract testing tools, mocking tools, various conversions, editors, observability platforms. So all this tool ecosystem is what help OpenAPI users to actually succeed and to build their applications quickly and to leverage OpenAPI in their projects. And actually, if you're interested about the reference OpenAPI implementations, there are many of them. There are multiple open repositories that list specifications. One of the popular examples, which is open source, is APIs Guru. And here you can see that some images are dated, but basically the service is there, and you can find a bunch of other services like that if you want to study how OpenAPIs are implemented. And one thing, if you visit this service, you will notice that many APIs are actually quite old. So for example, 2.x, which is basically Swagger, or 3.0 is a specification for OpenAPI from 2016. And actually that's okay, because for many years, there was little to no intention for OpenAPI to evolve. And actually, it's one of the biggest problems for developer experience with OpenAPI, and also it's one of the biggest advantages of OpenAPI as well in the past. So yes, Swagger appeared, if I recall correctly, in 2011 or 2012. In 2016, we got OpenAPI 3.0, which is basically rebranded Swagger with a few minor changes. And until 2021, almost nothing changed. There were just a few commits in the repositories, there were some discussions, but there was no real evolution of OpenAPI, and there were so many deficiencies that created problems for that. So it wasn't great. It created quite a lot of issues and struggles in the community. And this is one of the reasons why the Linux Foundation actually started OpenAPI initiative to improve the evolution of the project and to ensure evolution of this project as a multi-vendor collaboration. So there got some progress, and one of key highlights that finally in 2024, OpenAPI has more references and more search queries on the internet than Swagger. So yeah, the evolution is really going on, and at least there is some changes in the perception for OpenAPI. More importantly, OpenAPI has started changing technically, and there have been quite a lot of changes. So 3.1 was released in 2021, and after that there have been regular activities on improving the specification and how it would work. And the approach was basically like Moonwalk. So yes, you move forward, you want to ensure new features, new capabilities, better comprehensibility of OpenAPI, make it more easy to use for developers and for tooling. At the same time, OpenAPI has been evolving with backward compatibility in mind. So to ensure that there are no drastic changes that would break the tooling ecosystem and established Swagger and OpenAPI setting, well, there were hundreds and thousands of implementations in public that were available for people. So it would be a shame to break this ecosystem, and of course nobody wanted to do it. So OpenAPI continued to evolve in a kind of compatible way, and as Daryl presented at API Days, actually there have been quite a lot of updates that move the ecosystem forward. So there was OpenAPI 3.1, there were some patch releases, also there are new specifications like Arasa and overlays that help with the evolution. Soon there will be 3.2 release, there is Moonwalk, which is I'm talking about today, and 3.3. So quite a lot of things going on. And yes, speaking of that, Project Moonwalk. So Project Moonwalk was started a few years ago, and the idea was to actually improve how OpenAPI works and address common concerns. One thing to mention when I describe it today, that OpenAPI Moonwalk is still a kind of in ideation phase with a lot of discussions and a lot of activities going on, but there is no formal specification for OpenAPI 4, and more feedback and the work is needed. So everything I'm presenting today is rather about the concepts, or spoiler alert, some bits are actually available in OpenAPI 3, and we will talk about it. Okay, OpenAPI 4. So as I said, the goal was to actually address limitations of OpenAPI 3, like having more expressive API definitions and covering use cases that otherwise couldn't be described in the specification. For example, right now, you cannot say that there is request and response for this request. You can write it, but for response sample, you cannot say for which request this response sample would be actually sent. So there is a lot of limitations like that. And of course, for real specifications at the moment, that can be quite complex, that rely on parameters, for example, GraphQL, etc. You just cannot describe them with OpenAPI. And Moonwalk should become more flexible to address that, and also to provide better developer experience, so to make the specifications shorter and easier to comprehend. And of course, the idea is to also ensure that the ecosystem keeps growing and there are more contributions going on to the specification. For me, the most important part is developer experience. And for developer experience, a lot to be seen. One of the best explainers for OpenAPI and Moonwalk is one from Phil Sturgeon. It was published in 2014. If you navigate to the blog post, you can actually read quite a lot of information. And basically, again, all this information is aspirational, so it's what we want to see to happen. So Moonwalk, one of the key items is supporting different responses and being able to specify responses based on query parameters, headers, request bodies, and many other bits. Also, there is idea to support a broader range of URL patterns and pattern matching. Also make the definitions more simple and improve reusability of requests and response, so you don't have to repeat yourself multiple times when you have, for example, code 404, and you have to repeat it for any request and response multiple times until you start making mistakes when synchronizing these items. So yes, one of the items that is slated for OpenAPI 4 is proper data nesting. So on the left, you can see how it's how a sample request is now written in OpenAPI 3. And with OpenAPI 4, you can see that there are changes like removing non-informative fields, like what would be, for example, request. You can see that some item goes right to the field name, that we stop doing non-informative fields like codes, etc. So it becomes much more simple from the definition perspective. And as long as the tooling supports it, it should provide better experience. Also, as I keep saying, connecting requests and responses are super important for understanding how actually API is supposed to work in your service. And for that, there are multiple pattern connections. So for example, now you connect responses to query parameters, headers, body content. So you can you can describe the behavior in more details, and you can map the request. You can describe what request would do, what it may contain, and tie the responses to that. So it's a big advantage, and hopefully it will allow to even avoid custom definitions for API mocking tools like YMock, Microx in the future, because instead of that, you will be able to just use OpenAPI specification right away. We are not there yet, but it would be a good destination for these changes. Another thing is that OpenAPI 4 intends to support URI RFC, so you can be more flexible in terms of what you define, for example, in path patterns, in how they are processed, and more importantly, it would be a part of the existing standard, so it's not inventing of a wheel, but actually having a new protocol and a new implementation that can be just reused, as well as already created tooling for them. So this is what is currently communicated as something common in OpenAPI 4. The problem for that is that OpenAPI 4 still evolves really slowly, and if you are just outside contributor, you can actually perceive that it's kind of stalled. For example, there is some sporadic activity in the Moonwalk repository, which is a main repository for the specification. So if you go to OpenAPI, it's OAI SIG Moonwalk. So here you can see that basically last update 5 months ago. So again, from outsider perspective, it's concerning. But actually, a lot of communications and discussions happen not in the specification, not in the SIG repository, but actually in chats, meetings, GitHub discussions, and on Slack, because this is where the alignment happens, and this is what is most important in this part. So there is quite a lot of activities. You just need to find them and to connect them. Another thing, you may see that Moonwalk is basically the specification isn't there, so you don't know when to expect it. Initially, it was said that it would be shipped in 2024. So now it's December 10th, and there is no specification. And obviously, there will be no release of Moonwalk this year, or maybe even next year. I don't know. And one thing from an user perspective is that it's not really important, because Moonwalk is actually a path, not a destination. So there are many things that can happen now, including alignment, discussions, site specifications, or even features that can be ported right to OpenAPI 3. If you have a feature that improves developer experience, there is no real need to wait until OpenAPI 4 sometime later. You can integrate these patches right in OpenAPI 3, and this is what the team is doing. So shout out to Andreas, who actually shared some timeline I could communicate, and also shared feedback on this section. So OpenAPI 3 happens, and one thing then in late 2025, there will be quite a big update, but even what is landed now, I definitely advise updating to 3.2, which is about landing just in a few days or weeks, and there are many things that are already available to developers. So if you still use OpenAPI 3.0, if you still use Swagger, it's a good time to update, and also to update all the tooling that integrates with you. A few side notes from myself as a developer, what I would like to really see in the specification. First of all, for me, I am still not convinced that YAML as a modeling language is a good way to actually define the specification and how it would operate. Why? Is because if you use modeling language, you still get a model, and model is not detailed definition of the behavior. By design, it will miss some information. So for OpenAPI definitions, we have seen quite a lot of things, quite a lot of YAML files. These YAML files may be of different level of complexity, but the problem is that it's YAML, and all developer experience problems with YAML apply, like it being massive YAML file. You might need a ruler to properly debug it. There are no proper tooling. There is YAML schema which is not very functional. So normally people use JSON schema for editing YAML, but even JSON schema cannot define everything in YAML, and people go way beyond because it's basically a format that provides you full flexibility, which is quite dangerous. And the problem with YAML that while there are some tools to reference sections of YAML from one way or another, these tools are actually not unified and they're implemented different in IDEs. So basically you can continue repeating yourself in a YAML quite a lot, and then it's really hard to maintain it. Also, there are many common concerns about YAML. For example, there is no debug capabilities for YAML. You cannot really program YAML, or if you want to test YAML, there are so many different testing tools that allow doing it, but at the same time, it's quite complicated. So for me, it would be one of the items to actually address it in OpenAPI 4, how we could do developer experience better. One of the projects that is currently happening is overlays, is basically a specification that describes how to modify YAML and how to reuse components. If you're familiar with tools like Patch, XML Patch, so basically it's OpenAPI Patch that basically allows you to have an external YAML that defines how to patch things. It's a useful approach when you don't have any other option, but at the same time, this approach is really problematic and it's not something that I would normally advise to do. So this is what is happening. It's a workaround, but actually I would prefer to see OpenAPI as code when you have actually DCL and SDK that allows you to define OpenAPI definition. There are many perfect languages for defining behaviors or for building new DCLs, for example, Kotlin, that actually allow doing it. And for me, such coded language and generating YAML files from coded language would be a better approach than the current one. Or many other tools already generate specifications, so there are quite a lot of opportunities, and maybe we do not need this YAML as a central point. Another point that concerns me as developer quite a lot, so far that I even did a presentation last year, is extensibility. At the scale of OpenAPI, with everything using OpenAPI interacting through APIs, interoperability and extensibility basically become the same, because otherwise it's super difficult to develop services when you don't have enough flexibility and ability to extend the standards for your needs. So we described, again, you can find all the slides and information there. I'm not really stopping, but I just provide you one example of what concerns me. In the Velocity API, we have quite a few extensions. One of them, for example, defining a logo for the specification, or another example is defining a display name, which is different from name because sometimes we need localization and other tools. So for that, yes, we need to do OpenAPI extension, and it's a big problem because it's a very basic functionality. And when you have to implement the X logo or X display name, it means that everyone in the ecosystem has to do the same. And basically, it creates quite a lot of problems. So it's a kind of Babylon Tower with people implementing their own implementation, not talking to each other, not sharing each other with each other, and it creates quite a lot of problem. Just a few of real examples. Of course, logo is something you can do it on your own. But for example, authorization model, passing parameter values for response samples, feature flags, various conditional logic, stateful behaviors, all of that should be easily described somewhere in the core specification, but it's not something that is currently done in OpenAPI. And yes, it creates quite a lot of different problems for adopters and also for sharing the information. And for me, this is something that I would like to see to be resolved as a part of OpenAPI 4. So yes, the specification is not really enough. We need to do extensions. And again, this is something that happens quite often. For example, there is RISC-V registry of extensions, official and unofficial ones, which you can find. And pretty much the same. There are many plugins and extensions for most of common frameworks you use. For example, Gradle plugins, Jenkins plugins, or various libraries you may use for Java, Go libraries, yeah, you name it. In OpenAPI, we actually have OpenAPI's registry, which is again a part of what OpenAPI Foundation offers. And if you go to the registry, you can see that there are various things that are currently available. Like, for example, namespace registry, where you can define a namespace for you by good YAML types, I guess, or extensions or formats registry, where you can find quite a lot of beads and types, including various complex types, which is again helpful for specification because you can reuse the existing standards, RFCs, etc. What concerns me is that basically there is no extension registry at the moment. It was created once, and the only extension that exists at the moment is X Twitter. So yeah, it sounds a little bit ironic after the Twitter renaming, but it's extension that basically allows you to specify a reference to the Twitter account, and that's it. So this is the only community extension that listed at the moment. There is no authorization, there is no specification, no conditional behaviors and other things. We just have Twitter. And this part, yes, is depressing, and it's something that I would like to see changing and improving quite a lot. So yeah, just returning back to the slides. So again, extension registry is what should help us. Another thing that I'm not really talking is conflict and interaction of the specifications, because apart from OpenAPI, there is also Async API, which if you use Kafka, if you use webhooks, WebSockets, it's something that you have to use because it's defined for synchronous behavior and more complex behavior with workflows, stateful things, and many other things that OpenAPI just cannot describe by design. So there should be more interaction between these standards. And one thing to mention that, yes, there is collaboration between OpenAPI communities, Async API communities, and even at Apidays, we had really fruitful conversations at the booth. We had the same booth, so yeah, we had quite a lot of nice discussions. And yes, we know about these specifications and that at least tooling and approaches should be unified. One thing to mention that in OpenAPI, there is also work on the specification for stateful behavior for workflows. It's called Araza. So it's a specification that allows you to define a full workflow with interactions. And it's a site specification that you can try out, you can use. There is some initial tooling support that actually allows you to identify interaction between services, including multiple ones, and define algorithms. So if you need for stateful behavior, it's actually one of the things you could consider for your project. So that said, I really wish that Moonwalk happens. I want to see it. Yeah, the moment is still in the ideation phase. There is quite a lot of things happening here and there, which I'm super excited to see and contribute to. And if you are interested, again, OpenAPI is an initiative that is open for everyone. So if you go to OpenAPI's org, you can find that there is OpenAPI initiative. It's a foundation under the umbrella of the Linux Foundation that targets development of OpenAPI and future evolution. Here you can find a lot of information like governance, reference to the specifications and materials I presented today. And also there is a guide how to contribute and how to participate. So you can find a lot of information here, including various OpenAPI gatherings, contributing guidelines, how to contribute to spec, how to share feedback if you're an end user. So check out the sites. You can find a lot of information there. And for me, one of my advices, if you're interested, yes, there is community Slack where most of the conversations happen. So consider joining it. And yeah, there is a lot of things that can be discussed there. Okay, just a few takeaways for you. So if you consume open APIs, make sure to productize your APIs. For example, write documentation, adopt versioning, deprecation policies, and ensure that you maintain the specifications. Just putting the specification out there without proper maintenance is like throwing a code between dev and ops over the fence. You can do it, but it won't be real maintenance, and it will create quite a lot of issues. And yes, ensure that you update OpenAPI And if you depend on OpenAPI from other vendors or teams, also share information with them about new features, raise tickets, ask to update specifications to the new versions. Because for us, there are so many new features available. We want the tooling ecosystem to update, and actually contributions from users adoption is one of the key items to ensure that. And yeah, if you're a developer team, of course, invest in developer productivity and tooling, including API specifications. And if you want to talk, for example, about Velocity, Gradle, and other projects, reach out to me on Slack. I'm happy to discuss it, how we actually do it inside our company. And if you develop specifications, make sure to contribute back. Again, many of you might have already created some specification extensions, and just having them documented and being available to be reused is a great contribution to the ecosystem of OpenAPI. And if there are such contributions, there would be more interest from the community to also have proper hosting, marketplace for the specification, and maybe among vendors, like, for example, IDE providers, they would be interested to adopt these site specifications if they get popular. Also, try out Moonwalk, share feedback, any features, concepts would be nice. You can already find a lot of information on OAI Moonwalk. So here you can see that there is specification with some information. There are docs with some proposals, decisions that are being recorded, also some initial proposals that are currently being reviewed. So basically, this is a key areas where your feedback would be really useful, and that can help your developers to evolve their own APIs and definitions. And again, OpenAPI is driven by contributors, so it's a great way to participate and share feedback. We will at API Days, and hopefully next year we will come again. So if you're interested in going to Paris or to other API Days, it's actually a good opportunity to also meet the community, including practitioners, OpenAPI initiative. So Eric Wild, the ambassador of OpenAPI initiative, he travels to pretty much all API Days. So it's a good time to participate and share feedback. And on my side, so the slides, as I said, are already available. You can find it, and you can also reach out to me through different channels, and preferably use channels of OpenAPI initiative so that we don't invent any new channels. If you have any questions, yeah, OpenAPI initiative, Slack, I am happy to meet them. Thanks, everyone.